So, if you've ever opened up Hitfilm's Chroma Key Effect, you probably noticed that there are a lot of settings, 57 to be exact. And if you've ever tried to find a tutorial on how to use all those settings, you probably realize that most tutorials only cover at most 5 of these settings, out of 57. And even the settings that are covered aren't always explained very thoroughly, or at all. So when it comes to the Chroma Key Effect, you've probably been doing a lot of guesswork. But if I just described your situation perfectly, don't worry, there's hope, because by the end of this tutorial series, you'll know how to use every single setting in the Chroma Key Effect, because I'm going to be explaining every single setting in excruciating detail. So, let's get started. This is the footage I'm going to be keying in this tutorial. I've already made it into its own composite shot, and I'm also in the compositing workspace. So go to Window, Workspaces, Compositing, if you want your Hitfilm to look like mine. So I'm going to select my footage, go into the Controls panel, and under Effects, I'm going to add in the Chroma Key Effect. The Chroma Key Effect is in Hitfilm Pro by default, and it's also an add-on for Express. So I'm going to open this up, and in part 1 of this tutorial series, which is this part, I'm going to be going over how to use these settings that appear when you first open up the effect. I'm not going to be going over any of these other tabs, but don't worry, I'll go over them in later parts, and also, trust me, these settings are plenty for one video. So let's get started a little out of order with the color setting. This one is definitely the most obvious. It just defines the color that is going to be keyed out. So there are 3 ways to choose this color. You can either choose RGB values by sliding these 3 sliders here, so red, green, and blue. The second way is to use the eyedropper tool, so click and drag, and you can sample a color from your actual footage. So we can sample this green, for example. The third way is to click on the square at the very end, which will open up a window with a color picker. You can drag around the color picker, you can also set RGB values here, you can set hex values if you know them, and you can set hue, saturation, and value parameters. And these are actually really useful for keying, and I'll explain why later. So let's click OK, and go up to the view setting now that we've had some green keyed out. So by default, the view setting is set to result, which is just the final keyed result. Source is your original footage without any keying applied, so viewing the source is the same as turning the effect on and off. Status lets you view a matte with only 3 colors. So fully opaque areas are white, fully transparent areas are black, and any semi-transparent areas are the same exact shade of middle gray. So since status view only lets you see 3 colors, it becomes really obvious if there are holes in your matte that shouldn't be there. Matte view shows the accurate representation of your matte. So again, fully opaque areas are white, fully transparent areas are black, but semi-transparent areas are varying shades of gray based on how transparent they are. So even though the matte view is a more accurate representation of the matte, you can see how it sometimes makes it harder to see if there are holes in your matte that shouldn't be there. Whereas if you use the status view, those become a lot more obvious. Next is Despill Mask, which right now shows nothing because we don't have a Despill Mask, but I'll come back to this in a later part when we talk about spill suppression. And same exact thing with Despill Map, I'll come back to this in a later part, but basically this is just a matte of where spill suppression is going to be applied. One thing to keep in mind about the view setting is that it affects final output. So if you, for example, were viewing the matte and then you exported this footage, Hitfilm is going to export this matte. It's not going to export the final result unless you switch the view to result. So let's switch it back to results and come down to the gain setting. Sorry, we're kind of, skipping around, but I'm trying to go in the order that makes the most sense. So anyway, the gain setting. If I drag this slider back and forth, you can sort of grasp intuitively what the gain setting is doing. So it's changing the strength or intensity of the key. And if you're wondering why the green screen is gray, it's because spill suppression is turned on. So under spill suppression, again, I'm not going over spill suppression in this tutorial, but I'm going to turn it off for now just so we can see what's happening with the gain setting. So now if I increase the gain, you can see it's increasing or decreasing the range of colors that are being keyed out. So it's controlling the strength of the key. Now most tutorials just stop there with your intuitive understanding of gain, but I want to go a little bit more in depth. So I've prepared this image to show you what happens behind the scenes when you adjust the gain setting. So quick explanation, every single color can be represented by a unique combination of hue, saturation, and value. And this image shows hue, saturation, and value. So this outer ring here represents hue, or pure color. So every color on the ring has the same exact saturation and value. The only difference is the hue. And the inner circle represents saturation and value. So every single color on this, oh, did I say circle? I meant every single color in this square has the same exact green hue, but as we go from left to right, the colors become more saturated or more intense, and as we go up, the colors increase in value. In other words, they get brighter. So with that explanation out of the way, let's go into the controls panel, and I've already added in the chroma key effect with, spill suppression turned off. So if we use the eyedropper tool to sample a green color, and now we increase the gain, now you can see exactly what the gain is doing. So gain is increasing or decreasing the range of hues, saturations, and values that are being completely keyed out. So this might actually be easier to see in status view. So with the gain set to its default value, you can see that there's a very large semi-transparent area, as shown by all this gray, but there's a very small range of colors that are being made completely transparent. So like this very small black area here. But if we increase the gain, and you can see that range of colors that's being completely keyed out is increasing. And obviously if we decrease, that range will decrease. So gain controls the strength of the key. In other words, it controls the range of hues, saturations, and values that will be made completely transparent. So now you know exactly how gain works. Well, maybe not exactly, actually, because you might be noticing something in status view, and that is that there seems to be this very sharp cutoff line on the hue ring between the fully opaque areas and the transparent slash semi-transparent areas. And even if we increase the gain, you can see that that cutoff line, it never really changes. And if we go to result, you can see that even with the gain set at its highest value, the hues that are past this cutoff line will never be affected. And it turns out that we can change where this cutoff line is using the next two settings, Balance and Hue Balance. So for example, if I change the balance, you can see that that's affecting the cutoff line. So to see this better, I'm going to go over to another image. This is a hue circle, so every single color on here has the same exact saturation value. The only difference is the hue, so it just represents all the different hues. So again, I've already added the chroma key effect, so if we sample a green color, and I'm just going to increase the gain so it's easier to see. And now if I change the balance slider, you can see that balance is defining the size of a sector on this circle that the gain is going to affect. So we can have a large sector or a smaller sector. And since this circle just defines all the different hues, defining a size of a sector on this circle is the same as defining the size of a range of hues that the gain is going to affect. So we can have a larger range or a smaller range. Now let's go down to hue balance. So if we change hue balance, it's also pretty clear what it's doing. So hue balance, it's not changing the size of the sector, but it's shifting it from side to side in order to cover different hues. So balance determines the size of the sector, and hue balance keeps the size, but shifts it. So if this sector of a circle explanation made sense to you, that's great. But even if it didn't, don't worry, I have another way to explain it that might make more sense. So this is a hue rectangle. Again, same exact deal. Every color on here has the same exact saturation and value. The only difference is the hue. So if we sample a green color and then increase the gain so we can see it better, and now I change the balance, hopefully it's clear that the balance is changing the range, the size of the range of hues that is being affected by the gain. So we have a smaller range, larger range. And if we change the hue balance, you should see that the size of the range isn't changing, right? But if we change the hue balance, it's sort of sliding from left to right to cover different hues. So hopefully at least one of those explanations made sense to you, and also these images will be available for download for free in the description, so you can download them and mess around with settings yourself if you want. Alright, and one thing to keep in mind about the balance and hue balance is that they only affect the hue. They don't affect saturation and value. So to show you this, I have another image. Don't worry, this is the last image, I promise. So if we sample, or actually let me explain. So this image is, it just shows saturation value. So every single color in here has the same exact hue, but it just has different saturations and values. So if we choose a green color, and then we increase the gain, gain affects hue, saturation, and value, as you might remember. So gain is changing the colors that are being keyed out. But if we change balance or hue balance, nothing is happening because the only difference between these colors are their saturation and value, and balance and hue balance don't affect saturation and value. They only affect the hue. So just something to keep in mind. So to review, balance and hue balance determine the range of hues that the chroma key effect is going to affect, and gain determines the hues, saturations, and values within that range that will be made completely transparent. And of course, the center of this range that's determined by the balance is just the hue of the color you chose. So this hue right here, this is the center of that range. And actually, this reminds me, I want to quickly explain why hue, saturation, and value controls in the color picker are really useful for keying. So to do that, I'm actually going to go over to this image where we can see all three, hue, saturation, and value. So I'm going to set the gain back to its default value and go into the color picker. So basically, when you pick a color, Hitfilm will initially key out that exact color and colors of the same hue and higher saturations and values. So it won't completely key out or make completely transparent colors of the same hue but lower saturations and values. So for example, right now we have both a very high saturation and a very high value. So if you look at the image, you can see that there's a very, very small range of colors that are being made completely transparent. But if we, for example, change the saturation to a lower value, and then we click OK, then you can see immediately a lot more colors were initially keyed out by Hitfilm. So you might be thinking right now, that makes sense, but why did Hitfilm also key out a lot more hues and a lot more values if we only change the saturation? And that's a fair question, and the answer is that, as we know, gain controls the range of hue, saturations, and values that will be completely keyed out. But gain is only one number, and it's controlling three different parameters: hue, saturation, and value. So if one of the parameters is changed, then the other two will also be affected because gain is only one number. Okay, let's move on. We have two more settings to go over. If you've made it this far, congratulations! The hardest part is over. So let's go up to adaptive color. So adaptive color is used for green screens where there's a lot of variation in the tone and brightness, so green screens with a lot of uneven lighting. So if we check on adaptive color, you can see that first of all, a lot more colors were keyed out, and also it looks like the outline or the cutoff line became a lot more jagged. So basically what's happening here is that if we turn this off, instead of using this, perfect mathematical way of calculating which hues, saturations, and values should be keyed out, adaptive color is trying to intelligently predict what kinds of hues, saturations, and values should be keyed out based on your selected color. So it's trying to be more intelligent about it, so that's why it's become a lot more jagged. So let's turn that off and move on to the last setting of this part, pre-blur. So to show you what pre-blur does, I'm going to go back to my footage. Finally, that's enough theory for now. Anyway, I'm going to zoom in on an edge, and you can see that this edge is very, very jagged. But if we increase the pre-blur, that edge magically becomes smoother. But we don't believe in software magic on this channel, so what's actually happening? Well, pre-blur is just, if you couldn't tell from the name, it's just blurring your footage prior to keying in order for you to get a smoother edge. So if we go into the source, then you can see that indeed this was not shot at a very high resolution. It was shot on my phone. So this edge is very jagged. But if we, for example, added a blur effect, well, that's too much. So this is the original footage, and if we add even just a little bit of blur, you can see that that edge becomes a lot smoother. So that's exactly what pre-blur is doing. So it's blurring your footage prior to keying so that you get smoother edges. So let's delete that. And keep in mind that the pre-blur only affects the matte, right? So if you change the pre-blur, you're blurring or smoothing the matte, but pre-blur won't make your actual result look blurry, so don't worry about that. Okay, so that was the last setting of this part. To wrap up, I'm going to reset this chroma key effect and just walk through how I would key this footage with these settings, just so you can have, a more practical example instead of just color wheels. So, okay, I'm going to first use the eyedropper tool to pick a color from my footage. Then I'm going to go into the color picker and decrease the saturation a bit so that we key out more colors initially. I'm not going to use adaptive color for this particular example, but you can if you want. And I'm going to go to the view setting and go to status. And then I'm going to come down to the gain setting and adjust the gain until most of the green screen is keyed out. I'm also going to adjust balance and hue balance. So in practice, I found that putting these at either their highest or lowest values work the best. So I'm going to put balance at the lowest and hue balance also at the lowest. Now I'm going to scrub through my footage just to see if my key holds up for the entire time. And if your key doesn't hold up for the entire time, then all of these settings that we discussed they can be keyframed, except for view, but all the other ones can be keyframed. So you can, for example, keyframe the value of the gain or even the color to match the needs of your footage. So I'm not going to do any keyframing just for the sake of not making this tutorial too long, but just know you can do that if you want to or need to. So I think this looks fine anyways, so I'm going to change to results, zoom in on an edge, and apply some pre-blur. And you can also do this in the matte view, so just smooth out the edge a bit. And, be subtle with pre-blur, don't don't blur your subject out of existence. So just, a little bit goes a long way. And there you have it, a key that looks terrible. So this key is really bad, but that's okay because this is just the primary key. So these settings that we covered are used to make the primary key, where basically we're trying to get rid of most of the background. So in future parts, we're going to make this look a whole lot better using, matte enhancement, spill suppression, all that good stuff. So that's the end of this part. If you're still watching, thanks for watching. You're a real trooper. We went through a lot of stuff, and we also went pretty in-depth into some of the technical details. And, knowing the technical details isn't necessary to use the effect, but at least I think that it's useful to have an understanding of what goes on behind the scenes when you adjust a setting. I think it beats guesswork, at least. So hopefully this tutorial was, helpful to someone. If it was helpful to you, that's great, and I'll see you in the next part.